40 years. That is how long Alexander's generals spent killing each other after he died. 40 years of war across 3 continents. Poison, elephants, betrayal. A mother who sent her daughter-in-law a rope and a sword and told her to choose. An 80-year-old general dying on a battlefield looking for his son. A king sold out by his own soldiers for a bag of luggage. This is what happens when the greatest conqueror in history dies without writing a will. Go ahead and settle in. Find a comfortable position. Maybe dim the screen a little. Because tonight, we are going somewhere strange and far away, to a world that existed for a very brief, very violent moment in history, and then collapsed so spectacularly that historians are still arguing about the details 2,000 years later. We are going to the world after Alexander. Now, before we get into the chaos, and there is a great deal of chaos, stretching across 40 years and 3 continents, involving betrayal and poison and war elephants and a truly remarkable number of one-armed generals. We need to spend a little time with the man himself. Because you cannot understand what happened after Alexander the Great died without understanding what Alexander the Great actually was. Not the legend, not the Hollywood version, the actual historical person who was extraordinary and terrifying and brilliant. And by the end, probably not entirely well.
Alexander III of Macedon was born in 356 BC in a small northern Greek kingdom called Macedon, which the more sophisticated city-states of southern Greece tended to look down on as slightly barbaric and definitely provincial. The Athenians, in particular, had opinions about Macedonians. They were considered rough, militaristic, not quite properly Greek, despite speaking Greek and worshiping Greek gods and participating in Greek culture. This condescension would turn out to be a significant miscalculation on Athens's part, but that is a story for another night. Alexander's father was Philip II, who was himself one of the most capable military and political minds of the ancient world, and who tends to get overlooked because his son was so dramatically extraordinary that he eclipses everything around him. Philip took Macedon from a minor, embattled kingdom and turned it into the dominant power in Greece. He reformed the army, created the Macedonian phalanx, the deep formation of long spear infantry that would become the core of Alexander's military system. He fought, negotiated, bribed, and occasionally married his way to supremacy over the Greek city-states. He was preparing to invade Persia when he was assassinated in 336 BC at a wedding by a member of his own bodyguard for reasons that have been debated ever since. Alexander was 20 years old, and he moved very quickly. Within 2 years of becoming king, he had secured Macedon's northern borders, crushed a rebellion in Greece with sufficient force that nobody tried again, and crossed into Asia to begin the war against the Persian Empire that his father had planned. He would not return to Macedon. He would not return to Greece. He would spend the remaining 11 years of his life moving east, and then further east, and then further east still, until he reached what is now
Pakistan and his army, exhausted and homesick after a decade of marching, finally refused to go any further.
He conquered the Persian Empire, the largest empire the ancient world had seen, stretching from modern Turkey to modern Afghanistan. He conquered Egypt, where the priests of Amun declared him a god and a pharaoh. He fought through the mountains of what is now Afghanistan and the steppes of Central Asia. He crossed the Hindu Kush. He reached the Indus River. He wanted to keep going. His men did not. He turned back. He led his army through the Gadrosian Desert, which was a catastrophically bad decision that killed a significant portion of his forces, and which historians have been arguing about ever since. Was it a strategic error, a punishment of his army for their refusal to go further, or simply Alexander being Alexander, incapable of choosing the easy path when a harder one was available? Nobody knows. He probably didn't fully know himself. He reached Babylon in 323 BC. He began planning new campaigns, Arabia, possibly North Africa, possibly back east. He attended a drinking party on the evening of June the 2nd, 323 BC. He fell ill. He grew worse over the following days. On June the 10th or 11th, the sources disagree on the exact date, as they disagree on almost everything about Alexander. He died. He was 32 years old, and he had left no instructions. Part 2. The Deathbed and the question nobody could answer. Let's stay at the deathbed for a moment, because it is one of the more consequential deathbeds in history, and what happened there, and what didn't happen there, shaped the next 40 years. Alexander lay dying in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. The exact nature of his illness is one of history's great medical mysteries. The ancient sources mention fever, weakness, pain. Modern doctors and historians have proposed typhoid fever, complicated by heavy drinking and the accumulated damage of years of campaigning and multiple serious wounds. Others have proposed poisoning, which was certainly not beyond the capabilities or inclinations of the people around him. His death has been attributed to everything from a perforated stomach ulcer to West Nile virus. Nobody knows. What we know is that his generals gathered as he weakened, and someone, the sources vary on who asked, put the question that everyone needed answered. To whom did Alexander leave his empire? The story that has come down to us, and it may be embellished, is that Alexander was barely able to speak by this point. He managed to say, or was understood to say, one word, Kratisto, to the strongest, or possibly Craterus, to Craterus, one of his generals. The sources disagree, and the disagreement matters enormously, because one answer is a name, and the other is an open invitation to civil war. The name Craterus, if that is what he said, would have been a reasonable choice. Craterus was one of Alexander's most trusted and capable commanders, beloved by the infantry troops, experienced, respected. But Craterus was not in Babylon when Alexander died. He had been sent west with a large force months earlier, on the beginning of a mission to Macedon. By the time word of Alexander's death reached him, the situation in Babylon had already been decided by other people.
The other generals and officials who were present at the deathbed included men whose names you will need to remember, because they are the main characters of everything that follows. Perdiccas, Alexander's second-in-command at the time of his death, a Macedonian nobleman of real ability and serious ambition. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's oldest friends and companions, shrewd and patient, the one who would turn out to have the best long-term instincts of anyone in this story. Seleucus, a capable general who had commanded the elite companion cavalry and who was, at this point, watching carefully and saying relatively little. Lysimachus, another general, stationed in Thrace. Antigonus, called Monophthalmus, One Eye, who was governing a large portion of Asia Minor, and who was already the most powerful figure in the western part of the empire. And Antipater, the old general who had been left governing Macedon and Greece during Alexander's campaigns, now in his 70s, but still formidably capable. These men were not friends. They were colleagues, in the way that people who have competed intensely for the favor of one extraordinary individual tend to be colleagues, bound together by shared experience and shared allegiance to a man who was now dying, and looking at each other with the specific quality of attention that people give to rivals when the thing that kept them in check is about to be removed. Alexander died, and the question of who got the empire did not have a clean answer. What emerged over the days and weeks following the death was a compromise, the kind of compromise that tries to satisfy everyone and ends up satisfying nobody. Alexander's half-brother, Philip Arrhidaeus, a man of limited mental capacity who had never been considered a serious heir, was declared king. Alexander's wife Roxane was pregnant. If she bore a son, that son would be co-king. Two kings, neither capable of ruling. The real power would be held by a regent. Perdiccas, already positioned as second in command, became that regent. Everyone accepted this arrangement. Nobody was happy with it. And within 18 months, the killing had started. Part 3. Perdiccas and the problem of being in charge. Perdiccas had, in theory, the best position of anyone in the empire after Alexander's death. He was the regent. He held Alexander's signet ring, which Alexander had given him in his final hours, a gesture that may have been deliberately meaningful, or may simply have been what happens when a dying man hands things to whoever is beside him. He commanded the largest army. He was in Babylon, the center of the empire. In practice, his position was nearly impossible. He was trying to hold together something that had been held together by one specific, extraordinary person, and that person was gone. The empire stretched from Greece to India. The generals who governed its various parts were capable, ambitious, and very far away. Communication took weeks or months. Loyalty had been personal, to Alexander, and was now up for renegotiation. Perdiccas made several decisions in his first year as regent that were, in retrospect, not optimal. He canceled a number of Alexander's planned projects, enormous engineering works, expeditions, the repatriation of exiles, which annoyed various people who had been expecting those things to happen. He tried to consolidate his own position through marriage, which in the ancient world was not a romantic enterprise but a political one. He was reportedly in negotiations to marry Alexander's sister Cleopatra, which would have given him a direct
connection to the Argid royal family, Alexander's family, and significantly enhanced his legitimacy. The other generals noticed. The marriage negotiation, in particular, alarmed people. If Perdiccas married into the royal family while holding the regency and commanding the main army, he would be extremely close to being king in everything but name. This was not acceptable to men who also had ambitions and who had their own armies and their own provinces. Ptolemy moved first, in a manner that was characteristically indirect and characteristically effective. He was governing Egypt, a rich province, easy to defend, separated from the rest of the empire by desert. He had, in one of the more audacious acts of the entire period, intercepted Alexander's funeral cortege. Alexander's body had been prepared for transport to Macedon, or possibly to the oasis of Siwa in Egypt, where the oracle had declared him a son of Ammon. The sources disagree on the intended destination, possibly because different people wanted different things. The body was placed in an elaborate golden sarcophagus in a magnificent hearse,
accompanied by a large escort, and began its journey west. Ptolemy met the funeral procession, and he took the body to Egypt. This was not simply grave robbery, though it was also that. It was a political statement of the first order. Whoever controlled Alexander's body controlled the most powerful religious and symbolic object in the ancient world. Alexander had been declared a god in Egypt. He was treated as heroically divine throughout his former empire. His body was a relic, a legitimizing object, a thing that gave whoever possessed it a claim to special connection with the greatest conqueror in history. Ptolemy put Alexander's body in Egypt, and there it stayed, in Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded and named after himself, for centuries. Perdiccas was furious. He prepared to invade Egypt. Part 4. The First War and the River. The campaign Perdiccas launched against Ptolemy in 321 BC is known to historians as the First War of the Diadochi. Diadochi being the Greek word for successors, the term that has stuck to these men across the centuries. It was not the last such war. It was not even close to the last. There would be 5 major wars of the Diadochi before the situation stabilized into something resembling permanence, and the whole process would take approximately 40 years and involve most of the known world. But the First War is worth describing because it established several things that would define the whole period. Perdiccas marched his army into Egypt. Egypt was protected on its northeastern approach by the delta, the broad, wet, marshy mouth of the Nile, which was not good terrain for a Macedonian army used to fighting on open ground. Ptolemy had positioned himself well. He did not need to fight Perdiccas directly. He just needed to make crossing into Egypt difficult. Perdiccas attempted to force a crossing of the Nile at a place called the Fort of Camels. It went badly. The river was deeper than expected, or the bottom was softer, or the crossing point was worse than the scouts had indicated. The sources give slightly different accounts. Soldiers drowned. Equipment was lost. Crocodiles, which are not mentioned in the tactical discussions, but which were definitely present in the Nile in 321 BC, presumably did not improve matters. The crossing failed. Perdiccas tried again at a different point. That also failed. The army, which had marched a long way and was not being well supplied, began to grumble. And then, in a
moment that encapsulates something essential about how power worked in the Macedonian military system, the senior officers of the army held a meeting. Perdiccas was killed by his own officers. Specifically, according to the sources, he was killed in his tent by a group of his senior commanders, including Seleucus, who had been serving under him, and who apparently decided, with the cold, practical calculation that characterized his entire career, that Perdiccas was a losing bet. Perdiccas was stabbed to death. His body was reportedly thrown to the crocodiles, which is either symbolic or literal or both. The death of Perdiccas solved one problem and created several others. The regent was gone. The army was in Egypt with no clear leadership. The empire was now definitely going to fragment, because the one man with the theoretical authority to hold it together was dead, and whoever replaced him would have even less legitimacy. Ptolemy declined to take the regency himself. This was either genuine disinterest, he preferred his secure position in Egypt to the impossible job of holding the whole empire together, or political wisdom, or both.
He had what he wanted. He had Egypt. He had Alexander's body. He was not going to risk that by reaching for more. The regency passed to other hands, and the wars continued. Part 5. Antigonus One-Eyed, or the Man Who Almost Won. If there is a protagonist of the Wars of the Diadochi, or perhaps antagonist, depending on your perspective, it is Antigonus Monopthimus, Antigonus the One-Eyed. He had lost an eye at some point before the major events of this story. The sources don't specify when or how, which is frustrating. And he had governed a large portion of Asia Minor under Alexander, building up a power base and an understanding of the region that would serve him extremely well in the years that followed. Antigonus was old by the standards of this story. He was in his 60s when Alexander died, which made him a generation older than most of the other major figures. He was not a close companion of Alexander in the way that Ptolemy or Seleucus or Craterus had been. He had governed his province while Alexander campaigned in the east, maintaining his position and his power without participating in the great adventure. This gave him something that the others lacked, a stable, established base, and no particular attachment to the idea that the empire should remain unified under any single authority. He was interested in his own power, clearly and without apology. After the death of Perdiccas, Antigonus emerged as the dominant figure in the eastern Mediterranean. He had the largest army outside Egypt. He controlled extensive territory. He had a son, Demetrius, who was growing up to be a military commander of real talent, flashy and aggressive in ways that complemented his father's steady, calculating power. Together, Antigonus and Demetrius would be the most formidable force in the Successor Wars for the next 20 years. But Antigonus had a problem. His power was so great that it frightened everyone else. The other successors, who spent much of their time fighting each other, had a reliable tendency to form coalitions against whichever of their number became too dominant. This is a pattern that repeats throughout the entire period. The Diadochi were incapable of permanent alliance, but very capable of temporary alliance when one of them threatened to win entirely, and Antigonus kept threatening to win entirely.
The man who most consistently opposed Antigonus was Eumenes of Cardia, who deserves a significant pause because he is one of the most remarkable figures of the entire period and one of the least known. Part 6. Eumenes, the Greek who fought for a ghost. Eumenes of Cardia was not Macedonian. He was Greek, from the small town of Cardia on the Thracian Chersonese. He had served Philip II as a secretary and had served Alexander in the same capacity, rising to become Alexander's chief secretary and a trusted member of the inner circle. He was educated, literate, politically sophisticated in the way that secretaries and administrators tend to be. He had spent years watching the powerful make decisions and understanding how those decisions were actually made. After Alexander's death, Eumenes found himself in an unusual position. He was not a Macedonian noble. The Macedonian generals, who were the main players in the successor struggles, did not entirely trust him or respect him in the way they respected each other. He was Greek. He was a secretary by origin. And yet he was also an extremely capable military commander, which is a thing that sometimes surprises people, the idea that an administrator could also be a general. But Eumenes demonstrated it so consistently and so conclusively that even his enemies were forced to acknowledge it. He was loyal to the Arrhidaeus royal family, to the idea of Alexander's legitimate succession through Roxane's son, Alexander IV. This made him, in the chaotic years after Alexander's death, the main military defender of the royal cause against the generals who were carving up the empire for themselves. It was not a popular position. It was also, arguably, a losing position from the beginning, since the royal family had no real power, and the regents who nominally served them had all the actual armies. What made Eumenes remarkable was how long he held on. He fought Craterus, the beloved general, arguably the most popular man in the Macedonian army, and killed him in battle in 321 BC, which made Eumenes deeply unpopular with the Macedonian infantry and marked him permanently as an outsider who had killed one of their own. He evaded Antigonus's attempts to destroy him across multiple campaigns in Asia Minor and the Middle East. He retreated into the eastern provinces, where he gathered the Silver Shields, the elite veteran infantry unit, men who had served with Alexander for decades and were the finest soldiers in the world under his command. The Silver Shields are worth a pause. They were old. By the time of the wars of the Successors, many of them were in their 50s and 60s, veterans of campaigns stretching back to Philip II's wars and through the entire length of Alexander's conquests. They were also extremely conscious of their own status and worth. They had very decided opinions about who they would and would not fight for, and they were, despite their age, still formidable in battle in a way that younger, less experienced units could not match. Eumenes commanded them through several campaigns. He won battles. He survived situations that should have killed him. He was creative, adaptable, and possessed of the particular kind of stubbornness that keeps a person going after most reasonable people would have given up. In the end, the Silver Shields betrayed him. Antigonus had managed to capture their baggage train, all their possessions, the accumulated loot of decades of campaigning, the property of their wives and families who traveled with the army in the ancient manner, and the Silver Shields, when presented with a choice between loyalty to Eumenes and the recovery of their
baggage, chose their baggage. They handed Eumenes over to Antigonus in exchange for the return of their possessions. Antigonus had Eumenes executed. He then, having no further use for the Silver Shields, and apparently finding their capacity for betrayal somewhat uncomfortable, dispersed them to the most dangerous postings he could find, and made sure most of them did not survive the next few years. The elimination of Eumenes in 316 BC removed the last serious defender of the Arrhidaeus royal cause. The kings, the boy Alexander IV and the hapless Philip Arrhidaeus, had already been dealt with by this point, as we will get to. The fiction of a unified empire under legitimate Arrhidaeus rule was over. What remained was a collection of territories controlled by powerful men who were now competing openly for supremacy. Part 7. The Fate of the Kings. We have been circling around the royal family, the nominal rulers in whose name the successors were theoretically acting, and it is time to address what happened to them, because their fates are grim and somewhat swift, and tell you everything about how power actually worked in the world after Alexander. Philip III Arrhidaeus, Alexander's half-brother, had been declared king immediately after Alexander's death as part of the compromise settlement. He was, by all accounts, a man of limited intellectual capacity. The sources use terms that suggest what we might now describe as a developmental disability, possibly the result of childhood illness, or possibly, according to some ancient sources, deliberate poisoning intended to keep him from being a political rival to Alexander. He was gentle, harmless, and entirely unfit to navigate the world he found himself in. He was controlled for most of his brief reign by whichever powerful figure was closest to him at any given moment. After Perdiccas' death, he fell under the influence of Antipater, the old general who had been governing Macedon, and then, after Antipater's death in 319 BC, under the influence of Antipater's chosen successor, Polyperchon, and then under the influence of Olympias. Olympias, Alexander's mother, who deserves her own extended treatment because she is one of the most formidable and alarming figures in this entire story. Olympias was a princess of Epirus who had married Philip II and borne him Alexander, and who had spent the rest of her life pursuing the interests of her son and grandson with a focus and ruthlessness that made even the Macedonian generals nervous. She had been in something of an enforced semi-retirement during Alexander's campaigns, kept away from Macedonian politics by Antipater, with whom she had an implacable mutual hatred. With Antipater dead and the political situation fluid, she returned to Macedon in 317 BC. She brought an army. She confronted the army supporting Philip Arrhidaeus and his wife Eurydice, Eurydice being a young woman of genuine political intelligence who had been maneuvering to increase her husband's actual power and her own influence along with it. The confrontation between Olympias and Eurydice could have been a battle. Instead, when Olympias appeared before the Macedonian troops with her army, the soldiers on Eurydice's side simply refused to fight. They would not raise their hands against Alexander's mother.
the army dissolved. Eurydice and Philip were captured.
Olympias had Philip Arrhidaeus killed. He had been king for 6 years and had understood very little of what was happening around him. His wife Eurydice was sent a sword, a rope, and a cup of poison and told to choose her method. She chose the rope. She was in her early 20s. Olympias then conducted a purge of her enemies in Macedon that alarmed even the people who had supported her return. The bodies of her victims were reportedly denied burial, which in ancient Greek belief was a serious matter. The unburied dead could not cross to the underworld. This, combined with the executions themselves, turned Macedonian opinion against her more quickly than anything else might have. Cassander, Antipater's son, who had his own reasons to hate Olympias and his own claims to power, arrived with an army. He besieged Olympias in the city of Pydna. The city ran out of food. Olympias surrendered, reportedly on the condition that her life would be spared. Cassander did not spare her life. He brought her before a Macedonian assembly and had her condemned. Olympias asked to speak in her own defense. She was not permitted to. She was executed in 316 BC. She reportedly met her death without flinching, arranging her robes as she died, concerned to the last with the dignity of her appearance. She was around 60 years old. The boy king, Alexander IV, Roxane's son, the legitimate heir to everything, was kept alive a little longer under Cassander's control. He was murdered in 310 BC, along with his mother Roxane, on Cassander's orders. He was about 13 years old. His death ended the Arjad royal line that had ruled Macedon for generations. With the royal family gone, the fiction was over. The successors were now competing for their own kingdoms openly, without the pretense of serving a legitimate authority. In 306 BC, Antigonus declared himself king. The others followed: Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Cassander. All of them took the royal title within the next year. There were now multiple kings where there had been one. The empire was formally, officially, permanently divided. Part 8. Demetrius the City-Taker. Among the second generation of players in this story, the sons of the original successors, or the younger generals who rose to prominence as the older ones died, Demetrius Poliorcetes stands out with particular vividness. Demetrius, son of Antigonus One-Eye. His epithet, Poliorcetes, means the besieger of cities, and he earned it. Demetrius was, by the accounts of the ancient sources, extraordinarily handsome. This is mentioned frequently enough that it was clearly a notable fact about him, rather than the usual flattery applied to rulers. He was also charismatic, physically brave, and possessed of the military creativity that tends to produce memorable campaigns. He was also, by most accounts, catastrophically self-indulgent in his personal life, which was a significant political liability in a world where kings were expected to maintain the respect of their troops. His greatest military achievement, and it is genuinely impressive, was the siege of Rhodes in 305 to 304 BC. Rhodes was a wealthy, powerful island city-state that had refused to join Antigonus's coalition against Ptolemy, which was a problem because Antigonus needed Rhodes' cooperation to project naval power in the eastern Mediterranean. Demetrius was sent to take the city. What followed was one of the most remarkable sieges in ancient history. The Rhodians brought enormous siege engines,
towers on wheels taller than the city walls, catapults of various sizes, covered galleries for approaching the walls under fire, specialized naval equipment for attacking the harbor. The Rhodians defended with ingenuity and courage. They built
counter walls inside the city as the outer walls crumbled, conducted sorties against the siege equipment, used fire against the towers. The siege lasted a year, and the city did not fall. Eventually, a peace was negotiated. Rhodes would remain independent. Antigonus would get some of what he wanted. Demetrius would get his epithet and move on. The siege equipment he left behind was sold by the Rhodians, who used the proceeds to build the Colossus of Rhodes, the enormous bronze statue that stood at the harbor entrance and became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stood for 54 years before an earthquake toppled it in 226 BC. The bronze remained lying where it fell for centuries, too large to easily move, visited by tourists who marveled at its scale, even as ruins. Demetrius's other great achievement was the liberation of Athens from Cassander's control in 307 BC. He sailed into the harbor with a fleet, expelled Cassander's garrison, and restored Athenian democracy. The Athenians, who had a complex relationship with the Macedonians and who had spent years under various forms of subjection, were extravagant in their gratitude. They gave Demetrius divine honors, something reserved for gods, not mortal men, in standard Greek religious practice. They housed him in the Parthenon, the temple of Athena, which they presented as a suitable dwelling for his divine status. Demetrius accepted all of this with apparent comfort, which tells you something about the relationship between flattery and self-perception in the ancient world. The Athenians later regretted their enthusiasm when Demetrius's behavior in the Parthenon became known. The sources are somewhat vague about the details, suggesting that his conduct in the sacred space was not appropriate to its religious significance. The divine honors were eventually rescinded. Part 9. The Battle of Ipsus and the End of One Eye. The battle that came closest to deciding everything, that might have reunified Alexander's empire under a single dynasty, had it gone differently, was the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC. It was the largest battle of the Successor Wars, involving tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides, and crucially, hundreds of war elephants. War elephants deserve a moment of attention. They had entered the Macedonian military imagination when Alexander encountered them at the Battle of the Hydaspes in India in 326 BC, fighting against the Indian king Porus. The Macedonian army had never faced elephants before, and the animals caused genuine problems. Horses refused to approach them, the noise and smell and sheer scale of the creatures disrupting the cavalry that was central to Macedonian tactical thinking. Alexander had found solutions, but the encounter had made a deep impression, and the successor kings who controlled territories where elephants could be obtained, primarily through trade with India or through Seleucus, who had negotiated a large supply of them from the Indian king Chandragupta, used them as prestige weapons and as genuine tactical assets. At Ipsus, the coalition against Antigonus, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Cassander's forces, and Ptolemy's army, though Ptolemy himself did not attend, fielded approximately 400 war elephants. This was an enormous number. Antigonus and Demetrius had fewer, around 75. The battle began well for Demetrius, who commanded the cavalry on one wing and drove his opponents from the field in the aggressive, sweeping manner he had inherited from Alexander's tactical tradition. But he pursued too far, rode his victory off the battlefield and away from the main engagement, chasing fleeing cavalry when he should have wheeled back to support the center. This was the decisive error. In his absence, Seleucus used the elephant herd to block Demetrius's cavalry from returning to the battle. The elephants, arranged in a line across the plain, created a barrier that the cavalry could not break through. Horses simply would not charge into a line of elephants, and the time it took Demetrius to work around them was time that the center of Antigonus's army spent dying without cavalry support. Antigonus himself, old as he was 80 years old at Ipsus, which is a remarkable age to be commanding an army in battle, stood his ground in the center as his forces collapsed around him. The ancient sources say he kept looking for Demetrius to return. He refused to move. He died on the battlefield, surrounded by enemy troops, probably killed by a volley of javelins. He was 80 years old. He had fought in Philip's wars and Alexander's wars and the wars of the Successors for his entire adult life. He had been the most powerful man in the Macedonian world for 15 years. He died looking for his son, who was riding around the far side of an elephant line. Demetrius escaped. He was not done. He would eventually become king of Macedon for a few troubled years before that also ended badly. But Ipsus broke the dream of reunification. The coalition divided Antigonus's territories among themselves, and no single successor was ever again close to controlling the whole. Part 10. Seleucus and the Empire of the East. Of all the successors, Seleucus had perhaps the most dramatic personal story, specifically because he had an episode that most of the others did not, which was losing everything and then getting it back. After the death of Perdiccas, Seleucus had received Babylon as his province. He was a capable administrator and a careful political operator, and he began building up his position in Mesopotamia. But in 316 BC, Antigonus, who was at the height of his power and eliminating rivals systematically, forced Seleucus to flee. Seleucus left Babylon with nothing and went to Egypt, where Ptolemy gave him refuge. From Egypt, Seleucus watched and waited and participated in the coalition against Antigonus. When the coalition's combined forces gave him the opportunity, he returned to Babylon in 312 BC. The date, October 312 BC, was later taken as the founding date of the Seleucid Empire and the beginning of the Seleucid calendar. The Babylonians, who kept careful astronomical records, noted the return of their governor. What Seleucus built in the east was the largest of the successor kingdoms in terms of territory, an enormous swath of land stretching from what is now Syria and Turkey in the west to Bactria and the borders of India in the east. It was almost impossibly large to govern, crossing dozens of different cultures, languages, and administrative traditions. Seleucus spent most of his reign campaigning through it, establishing Greek cities as administrative centers. He founded dozens of cities, many of them named Antioch after his son, or Seleucia after himself, and trying to create a framework of Hellenistic culture and Macedonian administrative practice that could hold the whole thing together. He negotiated with the Indian Emperor Chandragupta Maurya, who had driven the Macedonian garrison out of the Punjab after Alexander's death and built a large empire of his own.
In northern India. The negotiation produced a treaty. Seleucus gave up the easternmost territories, including what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, and received in return 500 war elephants and a diplomatic marriage alliance. The elephants were the assets that gave him his advantage at Ipsus. The territories he gave up, he never got back. Seleucus outlived almost everyone. He was the last of the original successors still alive and still ruling. After the Battle of Corupedium in 281 BC, where he defeated and killed Lysimachus, the last of his generation, in battle in western Anatolia, he crossed into Europe. He was planning to reclaim Macedon, the homeland, the kingdom that had produced everything. He was 77 years old. He was assassinated at a beach near Lysimachia, in what is now European Turkey, by Ptolemy Carinanus, Ptolemy Thunderbolt, who was the son of Ptolemy I of Egypt, had been passed over for the succession there, and had attached himself to Seleucus's court while nursing grievances. Ptolemy Carinanus killed Seleucus with a knife or a sword while they were walking together. The last original successor died within sight of Europe, killed by a man he had been trying to help. Part 11. Ptolemy, or How to Win by Not Overreaching. And then there is Ptolemy. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, first of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ptolemy Soter, the Savior, a title given to him by the Rhodians for sending aid during their siege, which he accepted and kept. Ptolemy is the most interesting of the successors in some ways, because he is the least dramatic.
He did not have the military genius of Demetrius, or the strategic vision of Seleucus, or the terrifying energy of Antigonus. What he had was judgment, the consistent, repeated ability to assess a situation accurately and decide what he actually wanted from it, as opposed to what he might theoretically be able to reach for. What Ptolemy wanted was Egypt. He decided this early, and he never wavered from it. Egypt was wealthy. The Nile Delta was the most agriculturally productive region in the ancient world, and the country's geography made it naturally defensible. The eastern approach through the Sinai was easily monitored and controlled. The seacoast was long but manageable with a fleet. Once established in Egypt, Ptolemy was very difficult to dislodge, as Perdiccas found out when he drowned his soldiers trying. Ptolemy's decision to take Alexander's body was brilliant, for the same reason everything Ptolemy did was brilliant. It secured something real and durable at relatively low cost. Alexander's body in Alexandria gave Egypt a religious and symbolic significance that no other successor kingdom could match. People came to visit. Rulers came to pay their respects. Julius Caesar would visit the tomb centuries later. Augustus would visit. The body, eventually housed in an alabaster or glass sarcophagus in a monumental tomb, was the greatest attraction in the ancient world, and it was in Ptolemy city. Ptolemy also understood something about Egypt that the other successors did not quite grasp about their own territories. You needed to be Egyptian as well as Greek. He adopted pharaonic titles and participated in Egyptian religious life. His successors went further, with the later Ptolemies becoming deeply involved in Egyptian religious culture, building temples in the Egyptian style, being depicted in hieroglyphs in the same format as the ancient pharaohs. The famous Rosetta Stone, the inscription that allowed modern scholars to decode hieroglyphics, was created under Ptolemaic rule, bearing a priestly decree in both Greek and Egyptian.
The Ptolemies lasted in Egypt for nearly 300 years, longer than any other successor dynasty, ending only when Cleopatra VII, the last of the line, lost her kingdom to Rome in 30 BC. And Cleopatra was by most accounts the first Ptolemaic ruler who actually bothered to learn Egyptian, which says something about how the dynasty had maintained itself for 3 centuries. Let us step back from the individual stories for a moment and look at the shape of the whole period, because it has a shape, even if that shape is mostly made of chaos. The wars of the Diadochi are conventionally divided into 5 distinct wars, though the boundaries between them are somewhat artificial. The fighting was nearly continuous, with truces and alliances that reformed and broke and reformed again across 4 decades. The conventional endpoint is usually given as around 275 BC, when the Galatians, Celtic tribes who had invaded from the north, were defeated by Antigonus Gonatus, grandson of Antigonus One-Eye, at the Battle of Lysimachia, giving him firm control of Macedon and establishing the last of the major successor kingdoms in its final form. By 275 BC, the world looked like this. Macedon and Greece were controlled by the Antigonid dynasty, descendants of Antigonus One-Eye through his son Demetrius. Egypt was controlled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ptolemy's descendants. The vast eastern territories, Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, and points further east, were controlled by the Seleucid dynasty. These 3 kingdoms would dominate the eastern Mediterranean and Middle East for the next century and a half, until the expanding power of Rome absorbed them one by one. The last to fall was Ptolemaic Egypt in 30 BC. 300 years after Alexander's death. So the world after Alexander was not chaos in the long run, it was 3 kingdoms. But reaching those 3 kingdoms took 40 years of extraordinary violence,
involving some of the most capable military commanders in ancient history throwing armies at each other across 3 continents, and it destroyed the royal family that had produced Alexander, and it killed most of the men who had known him personally. The empire Alexander built lasted approximately 13 years in its unified form. What replaced it lasted 300. History is not always tidy about which versions of things endure. Part 13. The Poison Question. We should pause on the question of poison because it runs through this period like a thread and deserves direct attention. Alexander's death at 32, sudden and not fully explained, generated poison theories almost immediately. The ancient sources mention it. The most elaborate version involves Antipater, the old general governing Macedon, orchestrating Alexander's poisoning through his son Cassander, who was in Babylon at the time, using a substance reportedly carried in a mule's hoof to avoid detection. This story appears in several sources and has been taken seriously by various historians. The arguments against it are also serious. The illness Alexander exhibited lasted 10 to 12 days, which is not typical of ancient poisons, most of which worked much faster. The symptoms, fever, pain, progressive weakness, are more consistent with natural illness. Typhoid fever, complicated by heavy drinking and the accumulated physical damage of years of campaigning and serious wounds, is a plausible medical explanation that requires no conspiracy.
But poison was certainly used during the Successor Wars themselves. Olympias was accused of poisoning Philip Arrhidaeus, or rather of having poisoned him years earlier when he was a child, stunting his development. Poison appeared repeatedly in the succession struggles of the various dynasties. It was a recognized tool of court politics in the ancient world, and the people involved in these events were entirely capable of using it. Cassandra, who ended up being one of the main beneficiaries of the political situation in Macedon, controlling the kingdom, murdering the royal family, certainly had motive to remove Alexander. Whether he had means and opportunity in the specific form described in the sources is harder to establish. The poison theory of Alexander's death is not proven. It is also not disproven. It sits in the category of historical mysteries that will probably never be resolved because the evidence is too old and too filtered through sources with their own agendas. What is clear is that the people around Alexander were absolutely capable of it, and that several of them benefited from his death, which is not evidence, but it is context. Part 14. What Alexander was actually like. We have been moving through the story of what happened after Alexander without spending much time on what Alexander himself was actually like as a person, which is both a significant omission and a somewhat difficult subject, because the sources about Alexander are vast, contradictory, and all written well after his death. The primary sources, the accounts written by people who actually knew Alexander, are mostly lost. What we have are accounts written centuries later, drawing on earlier sources that are themselves of varying reliability. Arrian, who wrote what is generally considered the most reliable account, was writing about 500 years after Alexander's death. Plutarch, whose life of Alexander is vivid and detailed, was writing even later. The Roman historian Curtius Rufus wrote during the reign of Claudius, more than 3 centuries after the events he described. Through all of this filtering, certain things about Alexander's character emerge consistently enough that they are probably at least partly true. He was physically brave to a degree that alarmed his generals and sometimes endangered the campaigns. He fought in the front of battles, not from behind. He led cavalry charges personally, which was the role of the king in the Macedon military system, but he took it further than was strictly necessary. He was wounded multiple times, seriously on several occasions. At the siege of a city in India in 326 BC, he leaped from a siege ladder alone into the city, apparently unwilling to wait for his troops, and was severely wounded by an arrow that pierced his lung. His officers, who had jumped in after him in a desperate attempt to protect him, fought around his fallen body until relief came. He nearly died. His army, waiting outside the walls and not knowing what was happening inside, heard rumors that he was dead and panicked. He had to be carried out and displayed, still alive, barely, to restore order. He had a temper, a serious one. He killed Clytus, one of his oldest friends and companions, in a drunken argument in 328 BC, stabbed him with a spear, killed him on the spot, then spent days in inconsolable grief and guilt afterward. The incident is described in detail by multiple sources and seems clearly historical. Clytus had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus and had been with him since the beginning. The argument was about Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his increasingly divine self-presentation. Clytus was making
the kinds of pointed remarks that old soldiers make to commanders who are starting to believe their own mythology, and Alexander was not in a state to hear them. He drank heavily. The ancient sources are fairly clear on this. The drinking parties, symposia, were central to Macedonian aristocratic culture, and Alexander participated in them fully. The relationship between his heavy drinking and his death at 32 is something historians have considered at length. He was genuinely intellectually curious. Aristotle had been his tutor as a boy. Philip had arranged this, recognizing the value of the best available education for his heir, and something of Aristotle's wide-ranging curiosity about the natural world stayed with Alexander throughout his campaigns. He sent specimens of plants and animals back to Aristotle from the east. He was interested in the geography of the territories he was conquering. He asked questions about the customs and religions of the peoples he encountered. This curiosity coexisted with a willingness to destroy those same peoples when they resisted him, which is a tension that his ancient admirers tended to minimize and his modern critics tend to emphasize. He believed he was the son of Zeus Ammon, or at least he behaved as though he believed it. The oracle at Siwa, which he visited in 331 BC, had addressed him as the son of Ammon, and told him whatever it was that oracles at Siwa told important visitors, and Alexander left the oasis in a state that the sources describe as deeply affected. Whether this was genuine religious experience or political performance or some combination is impossible to know from the outside. He promoted his divine status in ways that were useful politically, particularly in Egypt and Persia, where divine kingship was part of the expected form, and in ways that caused serious friction with his Macedonian officers, who did not share the Eastern tradition of worshiping the king. He was capable of extraordinary generosity and extraordinary cruelty. He restored cities, and he destroyed them. He spared enemies, and he executed them. He treated conquered peoples with respect, and he massacred them. The pattern is not random. There is usually a logic to which enemies received which treatment, based on whether they had resisted when they might have surrendered, or surrendered when they might have fought on. But the range of his behavior across the campaigns is wide enough that you can find evidence for almost any characterization you want to apply to him. He was lonely in the specific way that very powerful people who are also very intelligent tend to be lonely. The people around him were clients and subordinates, and old companions who were gradually alienated as his behavior became more extreme. His closest relationships with Hephaestion, with his horse Bucephalus, were with people and creatures who could not really challenge him, which may have been partly why those relationships were so important to him. Hephaestion died in 324 BC, about a year before Alexander, and Alexander's grief was by all accounts extreme. He fasted, he cut his hair, he reportedly ordered the mane and tail of Bucephalus to be shorn in mourning. He conducted a massive funeral. He had the doctor who had been treating Hephaestion crucified. Bucephalus had died a year earlier at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Alexander founded a city on the site of the battle and named it Bucephala, after the horse. He also named a city after his dog, Perdiccas, though the location of that one is disputed. This is the man whose death created the world we have been describing. The world of the successors was, in a sense, the world that was left when someone capable of holding
Everything together, by force of personality and military genius, was simply gone. The successors were capable men. Some of them were brilliant. None of them was Alexander. And the empire he had built in 11 years of extraordinary effort could not be held together by anyone less. Part 15. The cities he left behind. Alexander founded cities, a lot of cities. The ancient sources credit him with founding anywhere from 8 to 70 cities, the range reflecting both the variability of the sources and the question of what counts as founding. Some were new foundations, some were refoundations of existing settlements, some were military camps that grew into urban centers. The most famous and most important was Alexandria in Egypt, founded in 331 BC, which became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world and remained significant for centuries. Alexandria was deliberately planned as a great city from the beginning. It was laid out on a grid, Hippodamian planning, the ancient Greek system of organizing cities in regular rectangular blocks, with broad main streets, a harbor designed for large-scale commerce, and from the beginning the infrastructure for the institutions that would make it famous. The Library of Alexandria, which became the greatest repository of ancient learning in the world, was established under the early Ptolemies, not by Alexander himself, but using the city he had built as the foundation. The Mouseion, the institution of scholars attached to the library, from which our word museum derives, was similarly a creation of the Ptolemaic period, built on Alexandrian ground. The library at its height reportedly held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, every text of significance in the ancient world, acquired through various means, including the practice of copying all books brought into Alexandria's harbor by visiting ships and keeping the copies while returning the originals, or sometimes keeping the originals and returning the copies. The library's destruction is one of history's great losses, though the destruction was not a single dramatic event, but a series of losses over centuries, fires, political upheavals, the simple deterioration of papyrus over time. What was in the library that is now gone, the lost plays of Sophocles, the complete works of Aristotle beyond the fraction we have, the histories written by people who were there, this is a loss that can't quite be measured because we don't know what we're missing. Alexandria also had the pharaohs, the great lighthouse on the small island at the harbor mouth, built under Ptolemy II and his sister wife Arsinoe, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stood for over 1,000 years, damaged by earthquakes in the medieval period, and finally collapsed in the 14th century. Its remains are reportedly still visible underwater in Alexandria's harbor. The other cities Alexander founded across the east were more variable in their fortunes. Some became significant urban centers. Alexandria Arachosia, now Kandahar in Afghanistan, is one, the name Kandahar being a corruption of Iskander, which was how Alexander's name was rendered in Persian. Herat in Afghanistan has similar connections to ancient Alexandria. Alexandria Iskate, the furthest Alexandria, in Central Asia, became the city of Khojend in modern Tajikistan. These cities were founded as Greek settlements, military colonies initially, populated by veterans and Greek settlers, governing themselves on Greek civic models, practicing Greek culture and religion in the middle of the Asian steppe or the Afghan mountains. They became transmission points for Greek culture eastward into Asia, and in time for Asian cultural
influences westward into the Hellenistic world. The mixing was real and lasting. Buddhist art in the centuries after Alexander shows Greek stylistic influences. The standing Buddha figure in robes that looks to modernize, slightly like a Greek Apollo, is one of the more striking examples of this cross-cultural transmission, a direct visual legacy of Alexander's Eastern campaigns in the religious art of Asia. The world that emerged from the chaos of the Successor Wars, the 3 kingdoms, the dozens of smaller kingdoms that existed in their shadows, the Greek cities scattered across the East, has a name. It is called the Hellenistic world.
The term was coined by the 19th-century German historian Johann Gustav Droysen, who saw the period between Alexander's death and the Roman conquest as a distinct historical era characterized by the spread and transformation of Greek culture across the ancient Near East. The Hellenistic world was not simply Greece transplanted eastward, it was a genuine mixing. Greek language became the common tongue of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, what is called Koine Greek, the common dialect, which is the language the New Testament would be written in 3 centuries later. Greek artistic styles influenced and were influenced by Persian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Indian traditions. Philosophy, science, mathematics, and literature flourished in the great Hellenistic cities, particularly Alexandria. The mathematician Euclid worked in Alexandria under the early Ptolemies, writing the Elements, which remained the standard text on geometry for 2,000 years. Archimedes from Syracuse was part of the Hellenistic scientific world, developing fundamental principles of mathematics and physics and engineering. The Archimedes screw, the lever, approaches to calculating pi, methods of determining volume. Eratosthenes, the chief librarian at Alexandria, calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than the angle of shadows at noon in 2 different locations and the distance between them. He was off by less than 2% in the 3rd century BC. Using geometry and observations without any technology beyond a stick in the ground. The Hellenistic period was also when astrology as we know it was developed, the mixing of Babylonian astronomical traditions with Greek mathematical approaches, producing the zodiac system and the interpretive framework that people are still reading in newspaper columns today. Medicine advanced, geography advanced, the model of the solar system, including the heliocentric model, the understanding that the Earth moves around the Sun, was proposed by Aristarchus of Samos during the Hellenistic period, and then largely set aside for 17 centuries until Copernicus. This is what grew in the world that the successors built, not the united empire Alexander had briefly created, but something in some ways more durable, a cultural world, a shared language, a set of intellectual institutions and assumptions that outlasted any of the specific kingdoms and shaped what came after. The Roman world that eventually absorbed the Hellenistic kingdoms did not destroy Hellenistic culture. It absorbed it, was transformed by it, transmitted it. The Roman Empire ran in Greek in its eastern half. The Greek language and the intellectual traditions of the Hellenistic world flowed into the Byzantine Empire, which preserved ancient texts in its monasteries and scriptoria for another 1,000 years. Alexander's empire lasted 11 years. The world his campaigns created lasted, in various forms, another 2,000.
We keep coming back to the elephants, and they deserve their own proper treatment, because they are one of the more vivid, specific details of this entire period, and they tell a larger story about how power and prestige worked in the Hellenistic world. War elephants, specifically Asian elephants, Elephas maximus, the larger-eared African elephant being a different species that was used later by the Ptolemies with more limited success, were the heavy armor of the ancient world. A full-grown Asian elephant stands about 3 meters at the shoulder and weighs several tons. In battle,
armored and carrying a wooden tower with archers and spear throwers, they were simultaneously weapons, psychological tools, and status symbols. The psychological effect on troops who had never encountered them was significant, and apparently not something you could easily train away. Horses, in particular, had a strong instinctive aversion to elephants. The smell, the sound, the sheer scale of them disrupted cavalry in ways that were very difficult to overcome. The Macedonian approach to fighting elephants, developed at the Hydaspes and refined through the Successor Wars, involved using light infantry with long spears to hamstring the animals, creating noise and confusion to disrupt their handlers, and working around them rather than through them. These approaches worked, but they required experienced troops who had learned not to simply run. The elephants themselves could be as dangerous to their own side as to the enemy. A wounded or frightened elephant is not reliably directional in its panic. Ancient sources describe multiple instances of battle elephants turning on their own troops. Their handlers, the mahouts who rode them and controlled them through long familiarity and specific commands, were the critical vulnerability. Kill the mahout and the elephant became unpredictable. Several ancient sources describe the use of a spike and hammer carried by mahouts for precisely this situation. If the elephant was entirely out of control and threatening its own side, the mahout could kill it quickly by driving the spike into the back of the skull. The elephants Seleucus obtained from Chandragupta, 500 of them, in exchange for giving up the Punjabi territories, were a transformative military asset. They were the decisive factor at Ipsus. They were the decisive factor in several of Seleucus's subsequent campaigns. Having elephants in the Hellenistic world was roughly equivalent to having tanks in the 20th century. Not invincible, but a significant advantage that shaped how enemies had to approach you. The trade in elephants became one of the defining features of Hellenistic geopolitics. The Ptolemies, cut off from the Indian supply by geography and politics, eventually developed elephant-catching operations in East Africa, modern Eritrea and Ethiopia, the region the ancient sources called Troglodyticais, using African forest elephants. These are smaller than Asian elephants and apparently less reliably trainable for warfare. The famous Battle of Raphia in 217 BC between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids was in part a contest between African forest elephants and Indian elephants, which the African elephants lost, the Indian elephants being larger and apparently more frightening even to other elephants. The Romans, when they eventually conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms, absorbed the elephant tradition too, using them in various campaigns with mixed results. Hannibal's famous crossing of the Alps with war elephants, most of which did not survive the crossing, is the most famous
episode. And it tells you something about how persistent the prestige of the war elephant was that Hannibal brought them across the Alps when the practical case for doing so was limited. The last war elephants in Mediterranean warfare appear in the early centuries AD. They disappeared as the specific political and economic networks that had supported their capture, training, and transport gradually collapsed. The Hellenistic world that had made them central to warfare was gone. The Romans had their own ways of fighting. The elephant era ended quietly, as most eras do. Part 18. The Long Aftermath. By the time the Successor Wars had burned themselves out and the three major kingdoms had settled into something approaching stability, the world was very different from what it had been when Alexander died. Macedon itself, the small northern kingdom that Philip II had transformed into the dominant power in Greece, the homeland of the Arrhidaeus dynasty and the source of the armies that had conquered the Persian Empire, was in significantly worse shape than it had been. The wars had drawn men and resources out of Macedon repeatedly. The invasions and political instability had damaged the country. The population of Greek Macedon that had produced the extraordinary army of Philip and Alexander was depleted. The Antigonid kingdom that eventually stabilized control of Macedon was a real power in the Greek world, but it was not the overwhelming force that Alexander had led out of Macedon in 334 BC. Greece below Macedon, the old city-states, Athens and Corinth and Sparta and the others, had been absorbed into the Hellenistic world in complex ways. The old civic independence of the polis, the city-states, was not simply extinguished. Athens continued to function as a city, continued to have its assembly and its institutions, continued to be a center of philosophical education that attracted students from across the Mediterranean.
but the actual political independence that the city-states had fought for so fiercely, that had produced the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War and all the dramatic political history of classical Greece, was gone. The city-states existed within and subject to larger power structures. They mattered culturally, not politically. Persia, which had been the great power of the East for 2 centuries before Alexander, was simply gone as a political entity. The Achaemenid dynasty that had built the Persian Empire, Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, the great kings whose names appear in the Old Testament and in Herodotus and in the inscriptions at Persepolis, was extinct. Alexander had killed the last Achaemenid king, Darius III, or rather had allowed him to be killed by his own nobles when they saw the situation was hopeless. Persepolis, the great ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, had been burned, possibly deliberately, possibly in a drunken excess. The sources disagree, and its ruins were left as ruins. The Persian cultural tradition did not disappear. It was absorbed into the Seleucid kingdom and eventually into the Parthian Empire, which replaced the Seleucids in Persia in the mid-2nd century BC. The Persians, the Iranian peoples, maintained their language, their traditions, their memory of the Achaemenid greatness through all the Macedonian and Hellenistic overlay. When the Parthians, who were themselves Iranian, established their empire, they drew on that Persian tradition and positioned themselves as its continuators. The Sasanian Empire that followed from the 3rd century AD explicitly presented itself as the restoration of
Achaemenid tradition. Persian identity proved more durable than the political structures that had tried to reshape it. Egypt, under the Ptolemies, became one of the most stable and prosperous of the Hellenistic kingdoms precisely because Ptolemy had understood from the beginning that Egypt's identity was ancient and deep and needed to be respected rather than replaced. The Ptolemaic kingdom lasted nearly 300 years. When it ended with Cleopatra VII's defeat by Octavian and her subsequent death in 30 BC, it ended not through internal collapse, but through the overwhelming external pressure of Rome. Part 19. What they were fighting for. One question that hovers over the entire 40-year period of the Successor Wars is the question of what exactly these men thought they were doing. What were they fighting for? The answer, for most of them, seems to have been power, territory, the resources that territory provided, security against being eliminated by rivals. These are not surprising motivations for ambitious men in a world where the largest pie in history had suddenly become available for division. They are comprehensible, even if they produced an enormous amount of destruction. But there is another layer to it that is worth acknowledging. Several of the successors, particularly Eumenes, and in his own way Perdiccas, seem to have genuinely believed that the empire should be kept together, that Alexander's achievement was something that could and should be preserved as a unity. Whether this was a sincere belief or a useful political position is hard to determine from the outside, but the behavior is consistent with genuine commitment. Eumenes died for it, which is a fairly strong signal. The others, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, were building their own kingdoms, which is arguably the more honest position. They had been Alexander's officers, his companions, his subordinates. They had served the vision, and now the vision was gone, and they were building what they could from the pieces. This is not cynical. It is what people do when the organizing principle of their world disappears, and they have to build something in its place. There is also the question of Alexander's legacy, what they thought they were inheriting beyond the territory. Several of the successors went to great lengths to associate themselves with Alexander's memory. Ptolemy had the body. Seleucus named cities after himself and his son in patterns that echoed Alexander's city founding. Demetrius accepted divine honors in Athens in the same spaces where Alexander's memory was honored. They were all, in different ways, trying to position themselves as the continuation of something rather than merely the opportunistic exploitation of a vacuum. This is perhaps the most human thing about all of them. They had served an extraordinary person. They had participated in something extraordinary. And when it was over and they were on their own, they kept reaching for the connection, kept trying to attach themselves to the greatness they had been part of. None of them managed it. None of them was Alexander.
But the reaching tells you something about what it must have been like to be in that orbit, to serve that person, and then to be left in the ordinary world without him. Part 20. One Last Night in Babylon. Let's go back to Babylon. June of 323 BC, the drinking party where Alexander first fell ill, the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, which was itself an ancient ruin by Alexander's time. Nebuchadnezzar had built it 4 centuries earlier, and the Babylonians had been conquered by
the Persians, and the Persians had been conquered by Alexander, and the palace had passed through all of this and was still standing, still imposing, still the most impressive royal residence in Mesopotamia. Alexander had plans. This is worth dwelling on because the plans he had at the end of his life tell you something about where his mind was and what kind of world he might have created if he had lived. He was planning an Arabian campaign, a circumnavigation of Arabia, which he wanted to explore and possibly conquer. He had commissioned ships for it. He was apparently interested in Arabia's trade routes and its position between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. He was also reportedly planning campaigns in the western Mediterranean, Carthage, possibly even Rome, which was at this point a significant Italian city-state, but not yet the world power it would become. Whether he would actually have gotten to Rome is one of history's great speculative questions. Rome was strong enough by 323 BC to have been a real challenge even for Alexander's army. But the question of whether a Macedonian Alexander might have encountered an early Roman republic before it had fully developed its own military system, and what the outcome of that meeting might have been, this is the kind of thing historians discuss at long conferences and never resolve. He was also reportedly planning to move the capital to somewhere more central to the empire he had built. Babylon was a reasonable choice, positioned between east and west, but Alexander had also apparently considered somewhere even further west. He was thinking about the empire as a permanent thing, not as a conquest to be administered from a distance. None of this happened. He drank at the party, felt ill the next morning, grew worse over the following days, was carried out to be displayed to his troops who feared he was already dead, lingered and died. The generals who gathered around the dying man were looking at each other across the deathbed, calculating. The empire that had taken 11 years of extraordinary effort to create would begin to fracture within months of his death. Within 20 years, the fracture would be complete. The world would be permanently changed, but not in the way Alexander had planned. History has a tendency to do this, to take the plans of the powerful and redirect them in ways that nobody intended and that produce outcomes nobody would have chosen. Alexander planned a unified empire under his continuing rule. What he produced, through the fact of dying young and leaving no instructions, was the spread of Greek culture across the ancient world in a more durable and more diffuse form than any single empire could have achieved. The cities he founded, the trade routes his campaigns opened, the cultural mixing his conquests began, the intellectual institutions his successors built, these outlasted any political structure by centuries. He was 32 years old in that Babylonian palace. He had conquered more territory in less time than anyone before or since. He had changed the world more fundamentally than almost anyone in ancient history. And then he left the room, and his generals looked at each other, and the fighting started. Part 21. The Small Things That Remain. History is kept alive by small things as much as large ones. The large things, the battles, the conquests, the deaths of kings, These are recorded and argued over and given their chapters, but the small things are often more telling.
The story of Alexander and the water. In the Gedrosian Desert, during the catastrophic march through what is now southern Pakistan and Iran, Alexander's army was dying of thirst. A soldier found a small amount of water and brought it to Alexander in a helmet. Alexander took the helmet. He looked at it. He looked at his army dying around him. And he poured the water into the sand. If his men could not drink, he would not drink. The army, watching, reportedly cheered. They were dying, and they cheered. Because the gesture was right. Because it was the right thing to do in that moment, even if it was also a calculated performance, and the water was too little to have helped anyone. The story of Bucephalus, the horse that had been with Alexander since he was a boy, that he had tamed himself at age 12 when no one else could manage the animal, by realizing the horse was afraid of its own shadow and turning it to face the sun. The horse that carried him through all the major battles of the campaigns until it died at the Hydaspes at an age of about 30, which is old for a horse and extraordinary for a war horse. Alexander named a city after it. This is the kind of detail that resists analysis. It is simply a fact about a person, a tenderness that survived all the violence and ambition and divine pretension. The story of the books. When Alexander was crossing Anatolia in the early days of the campaign, his supply of books ran out, and he wrote to Harpalus, his treasurer, asking for more, specifically requesting the works of Philistus and some tragedies of Euripides and Sophocles and Aeschylus. A conqueror, in the middle of a war, asking for Euripides. The letter survives in Plutarch. It is very human. The generals who survived him did not have these stories. They were capable, and sometimes brilliant, and occasionally extraordinary in their own ways. But the small human details that survive, the horse, the books, the water, belong to Alexander. The successors were historical actors. Alexander was something else. Part 22. The world they made. By around 270 BC, 50 years after Alexander's death, the world had settled into its new shape. 3 major kingdoms, dozens of smaller kingdoms and city-states operating in their shadows. The Greek language spread from the Adriatic to the borders of India. Greek cities scattered across the Middle East and Central Asia. The Library of Alexandria accumulating scrolls. Euclid writing geometry. Archimedes thinking about levers. It was not the world Alexander planned. It was, in some ways, a richer world than the one he planned, more diverse, more hybrid, more genuinely intercultural than a single empire under a single ruler would have been. The mixing that happened in the Hellenistic kingdoms, the blending of Greek and Egyptian and Babylonian and Persian and Indian traditions, produced intellectual and artistic work that neither Greek alone, nor Persia alone, nor Egypt alone could have produced. The 3 kingdoms would be absorbed by Rome over the course of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. Macedon fell in 168 BC at the Battle of Pydna, where a Roman consul named Aemilius Paulus demonstrated that the legionary system had evolved to the point where it could consistently defeat the Macedonian phalanx. The Seleucid kingdom shrank and eventually became irrelevant as Rome expanded eastward. Ptolemaic Egypt lasted longest, finally falling in 30 BC when Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra. But the Roman Empire that absorbed these kingdoms was not simply Roman, it was Roman and Greek. The eastern half of the Roman Empire ran in Greek. Roman-educated men
Greek, read Greek literature, collected Greek art, studied Greek philosophy. The synthesis of Roman political and military power with Greek intellectual and cultural tradition, produced the world that eventually became Western civilization in its various forms. And the Greek in that synthesis was the Hellenistic Greek, the diffused, transmitted, somewhat transformed version of Greek culture that Alexander's campaigns and the successor kingdoms had spread across the world. The men who fought over Alexander's empire for 40 years did not know they were doing this. They were trying to survive, trying to accumulate power, trying to build something that would last. Most of what they specifically built did not last very long by historical standards. But what they incidentally created, the cultural world, the cities, the institutions, the knowledge networks, lasted much longer than any of them intended. Part 23. Goodnight, Babylon. It is late now, or early, wherever you are. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the deathbed in Babylon to the deserts of Egypt, from the walls of Rhodes to the battlefield of Ipsus, from the scriptorium where Alexander's books were copied, to the underground tomb where his body lay in its golden sarcophagus for centuries. The men who fought over his empire are all gone. Perdiccas, killed by his own officers at a river crossing in Egypt. Craterus, killed in battle by Eumenes. Eumenes, betrayed by the Silver Shields and executed by Antigonus. Antigonus, killed at Ipsus at 80 years old, looking for his son. Lysimachus, killed by Seleucus at Corapedium. Seleucus, killed by a knife on a beach in Europe, within sight of the homeland he had not seen in 40 years. Cassander, dead of a wasting illness. Ptolemy, the only one to die in his bed of old age, having understood from the beginning what he actually wanted and refused to reach further. Their kingdoms lasted longer than they did. The cities they founded, Alexandria, Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, lasted longer than their kingdoms. The cultural world they inadvertently created lasted longer than all of it. And Alexander, in his golden sarcophagus, in the city that bore his name, was visited by Julius Caesar, who reportedly wept because by his age, Caesar's age, Alexander had already conquered the known world. Was visited by Augustus, the first Roman emperor, who accidentally broke the nose off the mummy when he leaned in to pay his respects. Was worshipped and commemorated and mythologized for centuries, becoming something larger and stranger than the actual person, the actual 32-year-old who had died of fever in a Babylonian palace in June of 323 BC. The tomb was lost at some point in the 4th or 5th century AD. Nobody knows exactly where it is now. Archaeologists have been looking for it for centuries. It has not been found. Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, is buried somewhere under modern Alexandria, in an unmarked grave, which would have horrified him. Or his grave is elsewhere, which would also have horrified him. Or the remains are so thoroughly lost that they will never be recovered, which is perhaps the most fitting ending for a story about the limits of what even the most extraordinary human being can hold together. The empire lasted 11 years. The world it made lasted 2,000. The man who made it lasted 32. You can close your eyes now.
The wars are over. The generals are gone. The elephants are gone. The libraries are lost and found and lost again. Somewhere under a modern city, in sand that has been sand for 2,000 years, the conqueror is sleeping. Sleep well. Part 24. The wives nobody talks about. The wars of the Diadochi were fought by men whose names fill the history books,
But behind every one of those men was a web of marriages, political alliances, and women who navigated an extraordinarily dangerous world with varying degrees of success and survival. The wives and daughters and mothers of the successor period deserve their own careful attention because they were not passive figures. They were active participants in the politics of a world that simultaneously used them as diplomatic tools and occasionally found them genuinely formidable. We have already met Olympias, who was formidable to a degree that frightened professional soldiers, and we have briefly met Eurydice, who married Philip Arrhidaeus and tried to exercise real political power through him before Olympia sent her a rope. But there were others. Roxane, Alexander's first wife, a Bactrian noblewoman, daughter of a local chieftain named Oxyartes, whom Alexander had married in 327 BC during the Central Asian campaigns, in what the sources describe as a genuine love match rather than purely a political arrangement, which was unusual. Roxane was fierce, intelligent, and entirely aware of the value of the child she was carrying when Alexander died. She gave birth to a son, Alexander IV, a few months after Alexander's death, and the boy's existence was immediately both his protection and his danger. He was heir to everything. He was also a target for anyone who wanted that everything for themselves. Roxane spent the years after Alexander's death trying to keep her son alive, which meant attaching herself to whichever powerful protector seemed most reliable and most committed to the Arrhidaean cause. She moved with the court, followed the regents, tried to keep her son visible and his claim active. She was not passive. She had, according to some sources, arranged the murder of Alexander's other wife Statira, daughter of the Persian king Darius III, whom Alexander had also married, because Statira's children would have been rival heirs. In the end, Roxane's intelligence nor her fierce protectiveness could save her son. They were both killed on Cassander's orders in 310 BC, hidden away in a fortress in Macedon, murdered quietly when the royal line had become inconvenient rather than useful. Roxane was probably in her 30s. Alexander IV was about 13. Cleopatra, Alexander's full sister, daughter of Philip II and Olympias, was another figure who understood the political value of the Arrhidaean name she carried and tried to use it. She had been queen of Epirus through her marriage, and after her husband's death she became one of the most sought-after potential brides in the Hellenistic world, because marrying her would give whoever married her a direct connection to the royal family. Perdiccas had been negotiating to marry her. After Perdiccas' death, several others approached. Antigonus, recognizing the danger of anyone else acquiring this particular political asset, had her placed under a form of supervision in the city of Sardis. She tried to escape, tried to reach Ptolemy in Egypt, was caught and killed in 308 BC.
Phyla, daughter of Antipater, wife of Demetrius Poliorcetes, was by all accounts one of the most capable and decent people in this entire period. She was substantially older. He was not a great general in the creative, dramatic sense that Demetrius or even Eumenes was. He was something perhaps more useful in the long run, a competent, organized, ruthless administrator who understood that controlling Macedon meant controlling the symbolic heart of the Macedonian world, and that controlling the symbolic heart required eliminating the people whose existence challenged his position. The elimination of Olympias and then of Roxane and Alexander IV were not acts of personal hatred necessarily, though Cassander's hatred of Olympias was reportedly quite personal. They were political necessities as he understood them. As long as the Arrhidaean royal family existed, any general or politician could rally support around the legitimate heirs and challenge Cassander's position. Killing the heirs removed that possibility.
He rebuilt Thebes, which Alexander had destroyed in 335 BC, as a punitive measure against a Greek rebellion. This was a significant gesture. Thebes had been one of the great Greek cities, the city of Epaminondas, who had taught Philip his tactics, and its destruction had been one of Alexander's less admired actions. Rebuilding it was a way of positioning Cassander as a restorer, a legitimate ruler who respected Greek civilization. He also founded Thessalonica, named after his wife Thessalonike, who was a daughter of Philip II and thus a half-sister of Alexander. Thessalonica is still there, the second largest city in modern Greece, having been continuously inhabited for over 2,000 years, bearing the name of a Macedonian princess who died around 295 BC. Cassander died of a wasting illness around 297 BC. His sons fought over Macedon after his death in exactly the manner that the previous generation had fought over Alexander's empire. None of them survived long. The Galatian invasion and the terror from the north. The Galatians arrived in the Balkans around 279 BC, like a force of nature, tens of thousands of Celtic warriors who had been moving southward and eastward through Europe as part of the broader Celtic migrations of the period. They were not a unified political entity with a central command. They were a loose collection of tribal groups moving opportunistically through territory that was currently disrupted by the tail end of the Successor Wars. They invaded Macedon, killed the Macedonian king Ptolemy in battle, and then pressed into Greece itself. They attempted to sack the sanctuary at Delphi, the great oracle sanctuary, the most sacred place in the Greek world, and were repulsed. The Delphic sanctuary was saved, and the Greeks who defended it remembered the defense as miraculous, the gods protecting their own house. Some of the Galatian groups were eventually settled in central Anatolia, in a region that became known as Galatia after them, which is where St. Paul would eventually write his letter to the Galatians, one of the books of the New Testament. These settled Galatians maintained their distinct identity and language for centuries while gradually absorbing Greek cultural influences. The kings of Pergamum made a particular point of fighting and defeating Galatian raids, commissioning famous sculptures commemorating their victories. The Dying Gaul is the most famous of these, the stone figure of a warrior in the act of death that still sits in the Capitoline museums in Rome, his distinctive Celtic torque around his neck, rendered with enough humanity that it reads as tragedy rather than triumph.
Antigonus Gonatus, grandson of Antigonus One-Eye, finally stopped the Galatian advance at the Battle of Lysimachia in 277 BC, killing a large number of Galatian warriors and establishing himself firmly as king of Macedon. This battle is sometimes taken as the conventional endpoint of the Successor Wars, not because the fighting between the kingdoms stopped, it continued, but because after it, the major successor kingdoms were established in something approaching their final forms. Part 28. Pergamon and the Smaller Kingdoms. Not everything in the Hellenistic world was one of the three great successor kingdoms. There were smaller kingdoms that carved out independent existence in the margins and the gaps of the great power competition. Pergamon is the most remarkable of these. It was a small city in western Anatolia that had been placed under the control of a man named Craterus after the Battle of Ipsus, holding a large treasury that had belonged to Lysimachus. When Lysimachus died, and Seleucus was then also killed, Craterus found himself in a position of practical independence.
His successors continued this careful balancing act. The kingdom of Pergamon grew, made itself useful against the Galatian threat, and cultivated a specific identity as a center of Greek culture and civilization. The Pergamene kings built a great library in their city, the Library of Pergamon, that reportedly contained 200,000 volumes and became the main rival to Alexandria's library. The story goes that the Ptolemies, alarmed by the competition, banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon, which forced the Pergamenes to develop a superior writing material from animal skins, parchment, the name derived from the city's Greek name, Pergamon. Parchment proved more durable than papyrus, better suited for the books we recognize, rather than the scrolls of the ancient world. Pergamon remained independent for generations, navigating carefully between the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and eventually Rome. Its last king, Attalus III, died in 133 BC and left his kingdom to Rome in his will, the most remarkable act of political will in the period, a king deciding that his kingdom would be better preserved as a Roman province than risk destruction in a war against Roman expansion. Bactria is another remarkable case, the far eastern reaches of Alexander's conquests, in what is now northern Afghanistan, where a Greek kingdom established itself and maintained its independence from the Seleucids for nearly 2 centuries. The Greek Bactrian king Menander I had famous dialogues with the Buddhist sage Nagasena that were preserved in Pali-Buddhist literature as the Milindapanha. A Greek king appears in Buddhist philosophy because Alexander's armies had gone that far east and Greek culture had taken root that far from home. Part 29. What the Persians thought. We have been looking at all of this from the Macedonian and Greek perspective. It is worth pausing to consider what the people who were being conquered and administered thought about all of it. The Persian nobility had a complicated experience of Alexander's conquest. Many of them had been killed, in battle or in the purges that followed. But many others had been incorporated into Alexander's administration, their positions and estates maintained or restored. Their daughters married to Macedonian officers in the mass wedding at Susa in 324 BC, where Alexander had tried to promote cultural fusion between Macedonians and Persians. After Alexander's death, most of this careful cultural bridge building was abandoned. The successor kingdoms were run by Macedonians and Greeks. The cultural mixing that Alexander had attempted was real, but it was fragile, dependent on the will of one powerful individual who was now dead. What replaced it was more organic and slower. Greek settlers in the eastern kingdoms intermarried with local populations over generations. Greek became the language of administration and culture, but it was used by people of very mixed ancestry. The Zoroastrian religious tradition of Persia, the ancient Iranian religion that predated even the Achaemenids, survived throughout the Hellenistic period. The fire temples continued. The priestly class, the Magi, maintained their role. Zoroastrian ideas about the cosmic struggle between light and darkness, about the end of the world and the judgment of souls, about the savior figure who would come at the end of time, these ideas were circulating in the Hellenistic world, mixing with Greek philosophy and with the religious currents of the Near East. The Babylonians kept their astronomical records through all of it. The astronomical diaries, systematic observations of the night sky, recorded on clay tablets, going back centuries before Alexander, continued to be made under the Seleucids. The Babylonian astronomical tradition combined with Greek mathematical methods to produce the sophisticated astronomical knowledge of the Hellenistic period. Part 30. The Libraries and What Burned. The Library of Alexandria was not just a collection, but an active research center, the Malseon, where scholars worked and debated and wrote. The Ptolemies funded it generously because a great library was a mark of civilizational prestige and because the early Ptolemies were genuinely interested in knowledge. The library collected texts from everywhere. It had people stationed at the harbor to copy books brought in by visiting ships.
It sent agents to buy texts wherever they could be found. It commissioned translations. The Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, known as the Septuagint, was produced in Alexandria under Ptolemy II. What burned in the library, not in a single dramatic fire, as the popular legend has it, but gradually through centuries of loss, is something we cannot fully inventory because we don't know exactly what was there. We know about texts that are mentioned in ancient sources but don't survive. The plays of Aeschylus, of whom we have 7 out of the perhaps 80 he wrote. The complete works of Aristotle, of which what we have are lecture notes and working documents rather than the polished works he wrote for publication. The histories of people who were there, Nearchus's account of the voyage from India, Ptolemy's own memoir of Alexander's campaigns, all of these are lost. This is a specific kind of loss, not the loss of things you know you had, but the loss of things you don't even know to miss. The shadows of lost books appear in references and quotations in surviving texts. You can see the outline of what's gone without being able to recover the substance. What survived did so through copying, through the deliberate choices of monks in Byzantine scriptoria and Arab scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, through the slow transmission of texts across languages and centuries. What survived is remarkable. What is gone is probably more remarkable still. Part 31. The Sciences of the Hellenistic World.
The intellectual flowering of the Hellenistic period was not confined to philosophy and literature. The sciences advanced in ways that would not be matched for nearly 2,000 years. Euclid, who worked in Alexandria, probably around 300 BC, wrote the Elements, a systematic presentation of geometry so well done that it remained the standard textbook from its writing until the 19th century. When Abraham Lincoln taught himself logic and rigorous thinking as a young man, he did it by reading Euclid. Archimedes of Syracuse worked in the 3rd century BC and is arguably the greatest mathematician and engineer of the ancient world. He developed methods for calculating areas and volumes that anticipated integral calculus by nearly 2,000 years. He developed the principle of the lever. He designed war machines for the defense of Syracuse against Roman siege, catapults, cranes that could lift Roman ships out of the water. He was killed when the Romans finally took Syracuse in 212 BC by a Roman soldier who did not know who he was. Tradition says he was drawing mathematical diagrams in the sand when the soldier interrupted him, and he said, "Do not disturb my circles," and the soldier killed him. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, the chief librarian at Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, calculated the circumference of the earth. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun was directly overhead at Syene in Egypt. At the same time in Alexandria, the sun cast a shadow indicating an angle of about 7.2 degrees from vertical. Since 7.2 degrees is 1/50th of 360 degrees, the circumference of the earth must be 50 times the distance from Alexandria to Syene. His result comes out between 39,000 and 46,000 kilometers. The actual circumference is about 40,000 kilometers. He was within a few percent. In the 3rd century BC. Aristarchus of Samos, in the 3rd century BC, proposed that the earth moves around the sun. He also proposed that the stars are very far away. He was right on both counts. His model was not accepted by most ancient thinkers. It was not seriously revived until Copernicus, 16 centuries later. Part 32. Alexander's Body and the Long Story of the Tomb. The story of Alexander's body after his death is one of the stranger threads in an already strange period. We have described how Ptolemy intercepted the funeral cortege and brought the body to Egypt. Initially, it was housed in Memphis before being transferred to Alexandria. The specific location of the tomb shifted over the centuries, and the accounts of what the sarcophagus was made of also shift. Gold initially, then alabaster or glass as later accounts describe it. The tomb was a destination for centuries. Julius Caesar visited in 48 BC when he arrived in Alexandria pursuing Pompey, and reportedly wept because he was already older than Alexander had been at his death and had accomplished so much less. Augustus visited in 30 BC after his defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, reportedly accidentally breaking the nose of the mummified body when he leaned in to pay his respects.
At some point in the late ancient period, sometime in the 3rd or 4th century AD, the tomb disappears from the records. The last clear reference to it dates to the late 3rd century. After that, nothing. No sacking, no documented destruction, just absence. The references stop. Archaeologists have been looking for the tomb since the 19th century. There have been dozens of claimed discoveries, all of which have turned out to be something else. Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, is buried somewhere under modern Alexandria, in an
unmarked grave which would have horrified him. He is somewhere, under a modern city, or under the sea, or in some location that nobody has looked yet. The man who wanted to be remembered forever is buried in an unmarked grave that has been lost for 1,700 years. The Hellenistic kingdoms that the successors built were absorbed, one by the expanding power of Rome, a process that took about a century and a half, from the mid-2nd century BC to the final absorption of Egypt in 30 BC. Rome's encounter with the Hellenistic world began seriously with the Macedonian Wars. The Roman legions and the Macedonian phalanx met in serious combat for the first time at the Battle of Cinisphali in 197 BC, where the Roman consul Flamininus defeated Philip V. The phalanx was extraordinarily powerful on flat ground, where it could maintain formation. The Roman manipular system, smaller units capable of independent movement, able to adjust to terrain and circumstances, was more flexible. In the broken, hilly terrain of Greece, the flexibility won. The Battle of Pydna in 168 BC finished it. The Roman consul Aemilius Paulus defeated Perseus, the last king of the Antigonid dynasty, and Macedon became a Roman province. Paulus reportedly wept when he saw the Macedonian phalanx deploying, not from fear, but from admiration for the instrument that Philip II had built and Alexander had wielded to conquer the world, which was now about to be broken by his own legions. The Seleucid kingdom survived longer in a shrunken form, retreating eastward as Rome absorbed its western territories. In 64 BC, the Roman general Pompey made it the Roman province of Syria. The Seleucid dynasty that Seleucus had founded nearly 3 centuries earlier simply ended, without dramatic last stand, without notable final moment. Egypt lasted longest. The last Ptolemaic ruler of any significance was Cleopatra VII, who managed to attach herself successively to Julius Caesar and Mark Antony in an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to maintain Egyptian independence. When Octavian defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC and moved into Egypt, Cleopatra killed herself rather than be taken to Rome for a triumph. Egypt became a Roman province. The last successor kingdom was gone. Part 34. What the soldiers wrote. History tends to be written about kings and generals and battles, but the ordinary soldiers who fought in the wars of the Diadochi left fewer records. What we can reconstruct of their experience is fragmentary and comes mostly from the edges of the historical record. The papyri of Egypt have preserved some voices from the ordinary level of Hellenistic life. Egypt, with its dry climate ideal for the preservation of organic material, has yielded enormous quantities of ancient documents, private letters, contracts, tax records, petitions, receipts. A soldier writing home asking for money, a widow petitioning a Ptolemaic official about her late husband's land, a young man in Alexandria writing to his mother that he has arrived safely and will send money when he has earned some. The mercenary soldiers who served in the successor armies left even fewer records. They came from Thrace and Lydia and Caria and various other parts of the Aegean world, attracted by pay and the opportunity of service in what was still the most militarily sophisticated tradition in the world. Some of them prospered, settled, founded families in the territories where they had served. Some of them died in the battles that the histories record only as numbers of casualties. Most of them are simply gone, not even a name preserved. The veterans of Alexander's campaign who lived into the successor period were a dwindling resource, increasingly valued and increasingly aged. a man who had marched with Alexander from Pella in 334 BC to the Indus and then returned, who then served in the Successor Wars for another 20 years, had seen more of the world and experienced more history than almost anyone else who had ever lived. He had seen the Persian Empire fall. He had seen the Indus River. He had seen war elephants. He had seen his king die young. He had then watched the world he had fought to create tear itself apart. What did these men think, sitting in their colonies in Bactria or their houses in Alexandria, looking back at all of it? We don't know. They didn't write it down, or if they did, it isn't preserved. Part 35. Demetrius, prisoner of Seleucus. After Ipsus, Demetrius retained control of some Greek cities and a fleet. He managed to insert himself back into Greek affairs, and in 294 BC, in a period of chaos following Cassander's death, he seized Macedon. He was king of Macedon for 6 years. He was a bad king of Macedon. He was inaccessible. He wore elaborate robes and surrounded himself with ceremony. He was difficult to approach with petitions, the ordinary business of kingship that Macedonian tradition held the king should attend to personally. He drank. He pursued pleasures at the expense of administration. The Macedonians disliked him intensely. He was driven out of Macedon in 288 BC by a coordinated attack from Lysimachus and Pyrrhus of Epirus. The Macedonian troops simply switched sides when the enemy appeared. Demetrius crossed to Asia with his remaining forces and began campaigning in Seleucus's territory. He won some early successes, but his forces were inadequate for a sustained campaign, and gradually his situation deteriorated. His soldiers deserted as supplies ran low. He surrendered to Seleucus in 285 BC. Seleucus did not kill him. He imprisoned him, kept him in comfortable conditions in Syria, reportedly allowing him wine, which Demetrius consumed in quantities that rapidly destroyed whatever health remained. He died in captivity in 283 BC, at the age of about 54, of what the sources suggest was alcohol-related illness. Demetrius had been one of the most spectacular military figures of his generation. He had besieged the greatest fortress in the Mediterranean. He had liberated Athens and been worshipped as a god there. He had been king of Macedon. He also made the error that cost his father's life at Ipsus, and he had been an impossible king, and he died in a prison drinking himself to death. History does not always resolve its figures into coherent lessons. Part 36. The philosophy that grew from the chaos. The wars of the Diadochi were not only a military and political story, they were also the backdrop against which some of the most important philosophical movements of Western history were developed, movements that were responding, at least in part, to the specific anxieties and dislocations of the post-Alexander world. Epicurus founded his school, the Garden, in Athens around 307 BC. Epicurean philosophy was organized around the pursuit of tranquility, ataraxia, the absence of mental disturbance, and the modest physical pleasures of good food, good company, and philosophical conversation. The Epicureans withdrew from political life as much as possible. They had a physics of atoms. Everything is made of atoms moving through void, including the soul, which dissolves at death. That was designed to remove the fear of divine punishment and the fear of death. If the soul dissolves, there is no one left to suffer after death. Death is nothing to us, because when death is present, we are not. Zeno of Citium founded Stoicism in Athens around the same time, teaching in a painted porch, Stoa Poikile, which gave the school its name. Stoic philosophy held that virtue was the only true good, that external circumstances, wealth, health, reputation, political success were matters of indifference, and that the wise person was the one who understood what was within their control and what was not, and focused entirely on the former. Both philosophies made sense in a world where political life was dangerous and largely beyond individual control. When kings were being killed by their officers and cities were being sacked, and the old certainties of civic life had dissolved, the Epicurean withdrawal and the Stoic insistence on internal virtue were reasonable responses. Both Epicureanism and Stoicism spread throughout the Hellenistic world and then into Rome. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor of the 2nd century AD, was a Stoic, and his Meditations is one of the most widely read ancient texts today. The Stoic and Epicurean you cannot control are permanent questions, which is why their answers have remained relevant. Part 37. The Ships of the Hellenistic World. The sea was not incidental to the wars of the Diadochi. The Eastern Mediterranean is a sea-dominated space, and naval power was central to the strategic competition of the period. The standard warship of the classical Greek period was the trireme, a long, narrow vessel propelled by 3 banks of oars, fast and maneuverable, designed for ramming enemy ships with its bronze-tipped prow. The Hellenistic period saw an escalation in ship size. The quadrireme appeared, then the quinquereme, then larger still. Demetrius's fleet included ships with 15 and 16 banks of oars, enormous vessels that sacrificed some of the trireme's speed for size, stability, and the ability to carry more marines and artillery. The naval battle of Salamis in Cyprus in 306 BC was Demetrius's greatest naval victory. He defeated Ptolemy's fleet comprehensively in a battle that established his control of the eastern Mediterranean for several years. It was this victory that prompted the declaration of kingship, the moment when Antigonus and Demetrius took the royal title, which the others quickly followed. The merchant shipping that supported all of this military activity is perhaps more important in the long run. The trade networks of the Hellenistic world, connecting Egypt and the grain of the Nile Delta to the cities of Greece and Asia Minor, carrying luxury goods from India and Arabia through Red Sea ports to Alexandria, moving timber from Lebanon and silver from the Spanish mines. These were the economic arteries of the world the successors built. Alexandria's harbor was one of the busiest in the ancient world. The lighthouse on the Pharaoh's Island was built precisely because the harbor traffic was so heavy that navigational aids were necessary. Part 38. Lysimachus, the Lion, and the Kingdom of Thrace. Lysimachus had been one of Alexander's bodyguards, the Somatophylakes, the personal bodyguard unit. He had been close to Alexander. He had, according to one tradition, been thrown into a lion's enclosure by Alexander in a fit of royal anger, and had killed the lion with his bare hands, which resolved the immediate problem and impressed Alexander sufficiently that
the relationship recovered. This story may be apocryphal, but Lysimachus was clearly a man of formidable physical presence and genuine toughness. He received Thrace after Alexander's death, a rough, difficult territory to govern, bordered by various Thracian tribes who needed to be continuously managed. He governed it competently for years, building up his position, expanding into Asia Minor when Antigonus's death at Ipsus created opportunities. His downfall came partly from his personal life. In his old age, he was influenced by his wife Arsinoe to execute his son Agathocles, who was his heir and commanded the loyalty of much of the army. The execution drove many of Lysimachus's supporters to defect to Seleucus. When Seleucus invaded in 281 BC, Lysimachus faced him at the Battle of Corupedium in Anatolia. He was about 74 years old. He was killed in the battle, one of the last of the original successors, the men who had actually known Alexander. The king who had killed a lion with his bare hands died on a battlefield in western Anatolia,
in a war with a man he had fought alongside for decades. Part 39. The Jews in the Hellenistic World. The encounter between Jewish culture and Hellenistic civilization in this period is one of the most consequential cultural collisions in history, with effects that ripple directly into the present through Christianity and through the development of Judaism itself. The Jewish community had been living under Persian rule in the post-Babylonian captivity period. Alexander's conquest brought them into the Greek-speaking world, and the Ptolemaic and Seleucid kingdoms that followed maintained this Greek overlay, while the Jewish community maintained its religious and cultural distinctiveness beneath it. The Septuagint was produced because the Jewish community in Alexandria, several generations after the initial settlement, was losing its Hebrew and needed the scriptures in Greek. This is a very human story. People moving, adapting, taking on the language of their new environment, gradually losing the language of their origin. The translation made the Hebrew scriptures available to Greek-speaking people throughout the Hellenistic world. The Maccabean revolt in the 160s BC was the most dramatic expression of the tension between Jewish identity and Hellenistic culture. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes attempted a more aggressive Hellenization of Judea, which the Jewish sources describe as including the desecration of the temple in Jerusalem. This provoked a revolt that produced both the Hasmonean kingdom in Judea and the festival of Hanukkah. The Hellenistic period was when the foundations were laid for everything that followed in the Western religious tradition. Greek philosophy, Jewish monotheism, Zoroastrian cosmic dualism, various Eastern mystery religions, all of these were mixing in the cities of the Hellenistic world, all of them contributing to the religious ferment from which Christianity would emerge in the 1st century AD in Roman-occupied Judea. Part 40. The coins tell the story. One of the best windows into the political psychology of the Hellenistic period is the coinage. Coins are small, durable, and produced in large quantities, which means that even if most records are lost, the coins often survive. And in the Hellenistic world, the images on coins were deliberate political statements. Alexander had been represented on coins during his lifetime in a relatively traditional Macedonian way. After his death, the representation changed. Ptolemy minted coins showing Ptolemy,
Alexander, wearing the elephant scalp headdress, the divine status made explicit. Later, Ptolemy put his own face on the coins, the assertion that the Ptolemaic king was himself the ruler, rather than merely the representative of Alexander's legacy. The portrait coins of the Hellenistic kings are extraordinarily varied and often quite realistic. The idealized divine ruler of earlier coinage gives way to something more honestly human. You can see in the succession of Ptolemaic coins the dynasty aging and changing, the powerful aquiline profile of Ptolemy I, the more refined features of his successors. The coins of the Greco-Bactrian kings in the Far East are particularly striking, some of the finest portrait coins of the ancient world, combining Greek artistic traditions of realistic portraiture with the specific physical features of individual kings in a way that feels almost modern. The coins crossed borders. They circulated through trade networks that connected the Hellenistic kingdoms to Rome, to Carthage, to India, to Arabia. Hordes of Hellenistic coins have been found in Britain, in Afghanistan, in Sudan, everywhere that trade reached.
They are the physical traces of an economic world that functioned across an enormous geographic range. Part 41. Pyrrhus of Epirus and the Art of the Useless Victory. Pyrrhus of Epirus was considered by the Roman general Hannibal to be the second greatest general in history after Alexander himself. Whether Hannibal actually said this, the assessment captures something real about Pyrrhus's military talent. Pyrrhus was king of Epirus, the region of northwestern Greece adjoining Macedon. He was related to the Arrhidaeus royal family and spent part of his childhood at the court of Ptolemy in Egypt after being driven from Epirus by political rivals. He returned to take his kingdom and then expanded. In 280 BC, the Greek city of Tarentum in southern Italy, threatened by expanding Roman power, invited Pyrrhus to help them. He crossed to Italy with an army that included 20 war elephants, the first time war elephants had been seen in the western Mediterranean. He won battles. He was a genuinely brilliant tactical commander, and his victories over the Romans at Heraclea and Asculum were real victories. But after Asculum, surveying the battlefield and counting his casualties, he reportedly said that another victory like this would destroy him. The Romans had more men. The Romans could replace their losses. Pyrrhus could not. This is the Pyrrhic victory, a victory so costly that it amounts to defeat. The phrase has been in use ever since, because it describes a real and recurring pattern in military and political history. Pyrrhus returned to Greece, tried to take Macedon again, went to the Peloponnese, tried to take Sparta, was unsuccessful, went to Argos, and was killed there in street fighting in 272 BC by a roof tile thrown by an old woman, or possibly a large pot. The sources differ on the precise projectile. He died in a street in Argos, hit on the head by something dropped from a window. History is not always dignified about how it ends its great military figures. Part 42. The second and third generations. The sons and grandsons of the original successors inherited the kingdoms that the wars of the Diadochi had produced, and faced the different challenge of ruling them in peacetime, or in something more closely approaching peacetime.
Antigonus Gonatus finally stabilized Antagonid control of Macedon, was a Stoic in his personal philosophy. He was a student of the Stoic philosopher Zeno, and reportedly took the philosophical relationship seriously, corresponding with Zeno and bringing him to his court. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, oversaw one of the great flourishings of Ptolemaic culture. The library and Mauseon reached their greatest extent under him. The Septuagint was produced under him. The lighthouse was built under him. Alexandria became in his reign the preeminent cultural center of the Mediterranean world. He was not a great military commander. He hired other people for that. But he was an effective administrator and a generous patron of culture and learning. Antiochus I and his successors faced the challenge of governing an empire that was simply too large, too diverse, and too lightly controlled to maintain coherence. The Seleucid kingdom bled territory constantly, to Ptolemaic Egypt in the south, to Pergamon in the west, to Parthia in the east. Each loss was manageable individually. Collectively, they represented the slow dissolution of the largest of the successor kingdoms. The pattern of Seleucid decline shows something fundamental about empire, that territory is easier to take than to hold. Alexander had taken the Persian Empire in a decade of brilliant campaigning. Holding it required decades more of grinding administrative work. The Seleucids held on longer than might have been expected given the size of the problem, but they could not hold on forever. Part 43. Alexander in the memory of others. How did the non-Greek, non-Macedonian peoples of the ancient world
remember Alexander? The answer varies enormously by culture, but the general pattern is that Alexander became, across much of the ancient and medieval world, a figure of legend rather than history, a template for the great conqueror, adapted and reshaped to serve the purposes of the cultures that received his story. In the Persian and Islamic tradition, Alexander appears as Iskandar, a romanticized figure who is both conqueror and seeker of wisdom. The Alexander Romance, a text that probably originated in Hellenistic Alexandria but was transmitted through many languages and cultures, presents an Alexander who searches for the water of life, who visits the talking trees that prophesy his death, who descends to the bottom of the sea in a glass bell. The Quran refers to a figure called Dul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, who is probably a version of Alexander, who appears wearing the ram's horns of Ammon, and who builds a wall against the armies of Gog and Magog. In medieval European tradition, Alexander was one of the 9 worthies, the greatest heroes of antiquity, alongside figures like Julius Caesar, Charlemagne, and King Arthur. Medieval romances about Alexander, translated through Arabic intermediaries from the original Greek, circulated throughout Europe. In India, the memory of Alexander's invasion was preserved primarily in the form of the date, which became a fixed point in Indian historical chronology. The Greek soldiers who settled in the Indo-Greek kingdoms became part of local tradition in ways still visible in the folk memories of certain communities in Afghanistan and Pakistan who identify themselves as descended from Alexander's army. Part 44. The Long Night of Babylon.
Babylon was ancient when Alexander arrived. It had been a major city since at least 1900 BC, nearly 2,000 years before Alexander was born. It had been the capital of Hammurabi's empire, where the famous law code was promulgated. It had been the seat of Nebuchadnezzar. It had been conquered by the Persians under Cyrus the Great in 539 BC, who had permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem. When Alexander arrived in 331 BC, the Babylonians welcomed him. The Babylonian priests and aristocracy welcomed him as they had welcomed Cyrus, because Babylon's tradition was to accommodate conquerors who respected its religious and cultural institutions. Alexander sacrificed to Marduk, the great Babylonian god. He ordered the reconstruction of the great temple complex, the Esagila. Babylon, under the Seleucids, was an important city, not the capital, which was Seleucia on the Tigris, a new city founded nearby, but a major religious and cultural center. The Babylonian priests maintained their astronomical observations, their religious rituals, their cuneiform writing tradition. They adapted to Greek administration while maintaining their ancient institutions. Babylon declined gradually. By the 1st century AD, Babylon was effectively abandoned as a city. The ruins were visible to travelers for centuries, enormous mounds of mud brick, the outlines of walls that had once enclosed one of the largest cities in the ancient world. The site of ancient Babylon is in modern Iraq, near the city of Hilla, about 85 kilometers south of Baghdad. The ruins of the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, where Alexander died, are there. Not much to look at now. Mounds of eroded brick. The greatest city of the ancient Near East, where the greatest conqueror in history breathed his last. It is a few low mounds in the Iraqi desert, a long way from the golden city it once was. Part 45. What Aristotle left behind. Aristotle was hired by Philip II to tutor Alexander when the boy was 13, and he taught him for about 3 years at a place called Mieza. What Aristotle taught Alexander we can only partly reconstruct. Certainly philosophy, rhetoric, medicine, natural science, and something of the political tradition of the Greek city-states. Alexander reportedly kept a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, under his pillow along with a dagger. The relationship apparently cooled as Alexander moved east and began to adopt Persian customs and divine pretensions that Aristotle would have found philosophically problematic.
The execution of Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes, who had been acting as the court historian, permanently damaged whatever remained of the relationship. Aristotle died in 322 BC, the year after Alexander. He left behind an enormous body of work. The surviving Aristotelian corpus covers logic, natural science, biology, physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, and literary criticism. It is, taken together, an attempt to systematically understand and organize all of human knowledge. His logic, the syllogism, the systematic analysis of valid inference, was not seriously improved upon for 2,000 years. His biology was the most serious attempt at systematic biology before Darwin. His physics was wrong in important ways, but wrong enough to be clearly wrong and to generate the questions that eventually produced correct answers. He left his library to his successor Theophrastus, and it eventually made its way to Rome after various adventures, including being stored in a pit to protect it during the Mithridatic Wars, reportedly emerging damp and damaged. The books in that library were the basis for
editions of Aristotle that we have today. We have Aristotle because someone put his books in a pit and they survived. Alexandria Escate, the furthest Alexandria, was founded in 329 BC on the Sir Daria River in what is now Tajikistan. This is deep Central Asia, the Eurasian steppe, the world of nomadic peoples, about as far from the Mediterranean world as you can get while still being in what the Greeks considered the inhabited world. Alexander founded a city here, garrisoned it with Greek and Macedonian veterans and some local recruits, gave it a Greek city plan with an agora and temples and presumably the administrative infrastructure of a Greek polis, and moved on. The city survived. It became Kohend, which is today a city of 500,000 people in modern Tajikistan. There is likely continuous habitation on that site from Alexander's garrison to the present day. 2,300 years of people living in the same place. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom that maintained Greek culture in Bactria for 2 centuries produced remarkable things. Its coinage was extraordinary. Its cities maintained Greek cultural institutions, gymnasiums, theaters, schools of philosophy in the middle of Central Asia. The city of Ai-Khanum, excavated in Afghanistan in the 1960s and 1970s, was a Greek city with a full Greek urban layout, a gymnasium with Greek inscriptions on the walls, a theater, a palace in Hellenistic style, all of it in the Oxus Valley, within sight of the Hindu Kush Mountains. The inscriptions included maxims from the oracle at Delphi, copied from the sanctuary in Greece and transported to this furthest edge of the Greek world. The city was abandoned sometime in the 2nd century BC, when nomadic peoples from the north pressed into Bactria, and the Greco-Bactrian kingdom collapsed. The site was forgotten. It was rediscovered by the king of Afghanistan during a hunting trip in 1961 and excavated by French archaeologists until the Soviet invasion of 1979 ended the work. Many of the finds were subsequently looted during the civil wars. The site itself has been damaged by the decades of conflict that Afghanistan has endured. Part 47. The Last Night of the Argad Line. The Argad dynasty had ruled Macedon for generations before Philip II. Philip II had taken this dynasty and made it the greatest power in the Greek world. His son Alexander had taken it and made it the greatest power in the known world. And then, within 20 years of Alexander's death, the dynasty was gone. Not declining, not diminished, gone. Every member of it had been killed, most of them deliberately by the men who were supposedly acting as their protectors or regents.
Alexander IV, when he was killed in 310 BC, was about 13 years old. He had spent essentially his entire life as a pawn. Born after his father's death, proclaimed king as an infant, moved from regent to regent, kept alive as long as he was useful, and killed when he was not. He had never ruled anything. He had never made a decision of any consequence. He had grown up in a world where his name was used to legitimize the actions of men who had no interest in serving him. His mother, Roxane, died with him. The Bactrian noblewoman who had married the conqueror of the world, who had borne his only legitimate son, who had spent 12 years trying to keep that
son alive. She died in a fortress in Macedon, killed on the orders of a Macedonian politician who had decided the royal line was now more inconvenient than useful. The Arrhidaeus name continued to be invoked for a while after the deaths as a legitimizing reference, but the line itself was gone. The family that had produced Philip and Alexander, that had transformed Macedon from a minor kingdom into the greatest power the ancient world had seen, simply ceased to exist in the space of 2 decades. History produces these silences, a dynasty that lasted centuries, ending in a generation. Part 48. The Silence After the Wars. By around 275 BC, the Successor Wars had burned themselves out into something approaching stability. The 3 great kingdoms were established in something like their final forms. The smaller kingdoms existed in the spaces between the great powers, navigating carefully, trying to survive. The world that had been remade by Alexander's campaigns and the Successor Wars was, in this settled form, genuinely remarkable. It was larger than the Greek world had ever been before. It was more culturally mixed than anything that had preceded it. It had institutions, the library, the Mauseon, the network of Greek cities across the East, that transmitted knowledge on a scale that had not previously existed. It had a common language, Koine Greek, that allowed communication across an enormous geographic range. The people who lived in it were, mostly, not thinking about these grand facts. They were running businesses and farming land and raising children and arguing with their neighbors and doing the things that people do in any historical period. The grand historical narrative is always an overlay on ordinary life. But the ordinary people of the Hellenistic world were living in something genuinely new. The world Alexander's campaigns and the Successor Wars had made was not the world before him. It was broader, more connected, more culturally mixed. The languages, religions, artistic traditions, and philosophical systems of many different peoples were in contact in ways they had not previously been. The results of that contact were not always comfortable or peaceful, but they were consequential. Part 49. The Long Echo. The world we live in now is downstream from the Hellenistic world in ways that are both large and diffuse. The influence comes through Rome, which absorbed the Hellenistic kingdoms and was transformed by them. It comes through the Byzantine Empire, which preserved Hellenistic learning. It comes through the Islamic Golden Age, when Arab scholars translated Aristotle and Euclid and Galen. It comes through the Renaissance, which rediscovered classical and Hellenistic texts. The geometry you learned in school is Euclid. The logical structure of argument is Aristotelian. The idea that the world can be systematically investigated and understood through observation and reason, the core assumption of modern science, is an ancient Greek idea that the Hellenistic world both preserved and extended. The religions that define much of the world's spiritual life are products of the Hellenistic period's cultural mixing.
Christianity emerged from the encounter between Jewish monotheism and Greek philosophy in the Hellenistic world. The Greek New Testament, the theological vocabulary of early Christianity, the philosophical frameworks used to articulate Christian doctrine are all Hellenistic products.
None of this was planned. Alexander planned to conquer the Persian Empire. He did not plan to create the conditions for the Septuagint, for Stoicism, for the dying Gaul, for Euclidean geometry, for the philosophical foundations of Christianity. The successor kingdoms planned to maintain their power. They did not plan to create the Library of Alexandria, or the Indo-Greek kingdom, where a Greek king discussed Buddhist philosophy with a Buddhist sage, or the cultural world that Rome would absorb and transmit to medieval Europe. History is full of these unintended consequences, the long-term results of short-term decisions, the cultural products of political conflicts, the durable legacies of empires that did not last. Part 50. Good night, Alexandria. It is very late now, or very early. The kind of hour when the historical becomes personal, when the distance between the ancient world and this specific moment in your specific life collapses a little. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the deathbed in Babylon to the river crossing where Perdiccas drowned his soldiers, from Ptolemy reaching up to take Alexander's sarcophagus to Eumenes in his tent, knowing the silver shields had decided their baggage was worth more than his life. From Antigonus at 80 years old on the battlefield at Ipsus, looking for his son, to Seleucus on the beach in Europe, killed by a knife, within sight of the homeland he had not seen in 40 years. From the scriptorium where Euclid was working out the foundations of geometry, to the gymnasium at Ai-Khanum in Afghanistan, where the Delphic maxims were carved into stone for Greek settlers who would never go home. From the library that burned slowly over centuries, to the coins that survived in hoards in Afghanistan and Britain and Sudan, small copper and silver circles, still carrying the faces of kings who have been dead for 2,000 years. The kings are gone. The armies are gone. The elephants are gone. The library is gone, or mostly gone. Alexandria is there, still there, a modern city of 5 million people on the Mediterranean coast, the harbor still shaped roughly as Ptolemy designed it, the lighthouse gone but its island still an island. Somewhere under that city, Alexander is probably still there, lost, buried under layers of history and modern construction and the water table and the indifference and Kime. The man who wanted to be remembered forever, who founded cities named after himself from Egypt to Afghanistan, who made himself a god in his own lifetime. He is in an unmarked grave in a city that bears his name, which is either a tragedy or a kind of justice, or simply what happens when a human being, however extraordinary, reaches the end of human things. The wars he set in motion by dying without instructions lasted 40 years. The world those wars created lasted 300 years as a coherent political entity and 2,000 years as a cultural influence. That is an extraordinary legacy for a man who died at 32. And for the generals who fought over his memory, Ptolemy who won by knowing what he wanted, Seleucus who won by patience and lost to a knife on a beach, Antigonus who almost won everything and died looking for his son, Eumenes who fought for a principle and was sold for a baggage train, Demetrius who was magnificent and impossible and drank himself to death in a prison. They too are gone, but not entirely. The world they made is this world, distantly.
Through Rome and Byzantium, and the Arab scholars and the medieval monasteries and the Renaissance and everything that followed. It is a long chain, very long, and this is the end of tonight's portion of it. The wars are over. The generals have made their final campaigns and their final mistakes and their final calculations. The kings are buried, and the libraries are lost, and the elephants are long extinct in this part of the world. The Bosphorus is still there. The Nile is still there.
The Hindu Kush is still there. The night sky that the Babylonian astronomers watched so carefully for centuries, recording the movements of the stars and planets on their clay tablets, is still there above you now. The same stars, in the same positions relative to each other, that the astronomers saw from the rooftops of Babylon when Alexander was dying in the palace below. You can sleep now. The generals have rested long enough. They can wait a little longer.